It was a historic moment for Germany, one that was celebrated the world over. The fall of the Berlin Wall on November 9th, 1989. The division of Germany stood for the division of the world into East and West, socialist and capitalist. Now German unity was possible. Headlines everywhere hailed the momentous turn of events. The fall of the wall symbolized the end of the Cold War and the old world order. Politically, the foundations of the Berlin Wall were laid in the summer of 1945 at the end of World War II, the bloodiest conflict in human history. Destruction on an unimaginable scale had been visited upon Germany. In Berlin, the former capital of Hitler's Third Reich, the survivors considered themselves lucky to be alive, whatever their losses. In Potsdam, not far from the epicenter of destruction in Berlin, Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin, U.S. President Harry S. Truman, and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill met to decide the fate of their vanquished foe. Germany was divided into occupation zones, while Berlin, located within the Soviet zone, would be governed jointly. But the Cold War was already looming. A U.S. Army orientation film gives insight into post-war attitudes.
After the war, Germany was split up into 4 zones, each separated from the others by political and economic barriers. Almost immediately, Russia drew a curtain of secrecy between the other zones and her own. Behind this curtain, the Red Army began ruling eastern Germany in a way to leave no doubt as to who lost the war.
In the first years after the war, hundreds of thousands fled the Soviet occupation zone. Western German newsreels reported.
A Soviet century. Led by experienced guides, people slip easily across the border, but if they're caught, they're sent to the Soviet commanders.
By 1948, distrust between the West and the Soviets ran deep. In June, the Western Allies introduced a single currency, the Deutschmark, in their occupation zones. This led to a final break with the Soviet Union. The Soviet occupation forces blockaded land and water access routes to West Berlin. No supplies could get in or out. But Stalin's attempt to isolate and bring West Berlin under his control was doomed to fail. With the most spectacular rescue in the history of aviation, Britain and the U.S. kept the city supplied. The Berlin airlift brought food and fuel to the people of West Berlin so that they would not have to turn to the Soviets to survive. Many pilots tossed candy and chocolate to children on the ground. The airlift went on for more than a year. In that time, the pilots flew nearly 300,000 missions. Accidents were bound to occur. 78 people, most of them pilots and crew, lost their lives. In August 1948, the Soviets had marked off their sector of Berlin. Within 14 months, 2 republics were founded. The French, British, and American zones became the Federal Republic of Germany. In October 1949, the Soviet zone became the German Democratic Republic, East Germany. The yearning of Germany's communists for a socialist future seemed to have come true at last.
It was as if a cheerful, warm spring breeze had carried these young people's song. It's a different world and a different kind of parade. Now the free German youth are on the march.
The Soviet propaganda film Democratic Germany portrayed the socialist workers' and farmers' state as the more advanced part of Germany. But people were still streaming out of East Germany for the West. By the spring of 1952, East Germany had put up barbed wire to keep them in. Dissatisfaction with the regime came to a head on June 17, 1953, during a demonstration by striking construction workers. They were protesting against demands that they work longer hours for the same pay, and in their anger, they tore up symbols of German-Soviet friendship. The situation spiraled out of control. With the help of Soviet tanks, the protests were violently put down. West German news reported.
Russian tanks advanced, instruments of violence against freedom. With the courage of people who have nothing left to lose, the workers attacked the tanks with iron bars and stones. The calls for unity and freedom grew ever louder.
The inner German border had become the ultimate frontier between East and West, complete with abandoned railway lines, downed power cables, patrols, and watchtowers. But there was still one opening in the Iron Curtain: Berlin. Hundreds of thousands kept on pouring through the open Soviet sector gates, many of them the best educated and most highly qualified of East German society. Headlines in the West said people in the East were voting with their feet. The refugee situation became a crisis, and by 1961, rumors were rife that the communist regime wanted to build a wall. East German leader Walter Ulbricht was asked about it at a press conference.
I am not aware of any such intentions. The construction workers in the capital are mainly occupied with building apartments, and their labor is being utilized at full capacity to that end. No one has any intention of building a wall.
One of the most infamous political lies in history. Within weeks, East Berlin trucks and tanks were moving out for a top-secret mission called Operation Wall of China. More than 10,000 men began to secure the sector boundary between East and West Berlin. Armed guards were posted at the Brandenburg Gate, leaving no doubt as to the seriousness of the situation. The West looked on, shocked and helpless, as the wall went up. Force was not an option without risking an all-out war. Under military supervision, construction workers tore up streets along the border and erected temporary barriers. Within hours, traffic between the sectors had been stopped. West Berlin was surrounded by a fence some 160 kilometers long. Millions of people had left East Germany since 1945, a substantial part of the population. That flood would now be choked to a trickle. As the wall went up, dramatic scenes played out. Western cameras were on an East German border guard when he suddenly decided to defect. The image became a Cold War icon of the desire for freedom. Paradoxical though it may seem, Washington, Paris, and London were in fact relieved that the refugee situation had finally been dealt with. It had been a growing source of tension between the superpowers, and the Western Allies' rights concerning West Berlin were left intact. No French, British, or American soldiers hindered the construction efforts. East German workers replaced the temporary street barriers with a wall about 2 meters high. West Berliners were stunned. Family members, friends, and loved ones were being forcibly separated within their own country. Confidence in the Allied forces was waning as well. No one could say when or if the Soviet noose would tighten around the throat of West Berlin. The Americans tried to bolster confidence in the city. President John F. Kennedy sent his Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson to Berlin. Johnson declared that the United States would defend West Berlin's freedom at all costs. The very same day, a battle-ready American Army unit crossed East Germany on the transit highway to be welcomed by cheering West Berliners. Washington had not stopped the Berlin Wall from being built, but insisted on the U.S.'s right to move freely through both parts of the city. It was a tense standoff that could have flared up at any moment. Months later, the Cold War moved to the brink of open hostilities when a U.S. soldier was denied entry into East Berlin. U.S. and Soviet tanks confronted each other at Checkpoint Charlie in the heart of the city. For 16 hours, the world watched with bated breath to see who would take the next step. But the Soviet tanks backed down, and so did the Americans. Meanwhile, many East Germans were still attempting to escape. Bernauer Straße was one of the streets where the buildings were in the east and the sidewalks in front of them were in the west. The escape attempts grew more daring. There were deaths and injuries. West Berliners helped out when they could. The fire department held up blankets. Dramas unfolded as the world watched. This 77-year-old woman stood above the fireman's blanket for a quarter of an hour before East German officers broke into her apartment and tried to drag her back inside. They failed. After that incident, tenants living in buildings along the sector boundary were evicted. Windows and entrances facing the border were bricked up. All along the wall, people were moved out, buildings were demolished, and gardens paved over. Workers dug up trees and bushes that could serve as cover. A 10-meter-wide death strip was cleared on the eastern side of the border. But not even that ended the troubles along the wall. Months after the Berlin Wall had gone up, East Germans were trying to flee to the west to cross those parts of the wall that were not yet built up. They were taking their lives in their hands. The guards along the wall had orders to use any means necessary to stop people crossing, as an East German training film demonstrates.
A border guard's training is tough. You'll be in the front lines at all times. Even wearing a gas mask, they must be able to shoot with the same results as under normal conditions.
Well-trained guards were not all defectors had to fear. The military had laid booby traps that would set off a silent alarm, and even landmines all along the wall and the secondary fences.
A border violator is nearing the guard post. Now the border violator is on a line with the guard post. The guard calls out. The border violator throws caution to the winds. The forceful use of arms prevented the border violation in this case.
More than 40 people died in the attempt to cross the Berlin Wall in the first year alone. One was 18-year-old Peter Fechter. In August 1962, Fechter and a friend tried to climb over the Berlin Wall. The friend made it, but Fechter was shot halfway up the wall and fell back onto East German territory. He bled to death, shouting and moaning for help as a crowd gathered on the western side. After he was dead, East German border troops collected his body. The death of Peter Fechter became a symbol of the East German regime's inhumanity. That same regime portrayed the Berlin Wall quite differently, calling it an anti-fascist protective barrier meant to shield East Germany from spying, sabotage, smuggling, infiltration, and aggression from the West. By the late 1960s, the border security system was all but impenetrable. The wall had become a symbol of the division of the world. U.S. President John F. Kennedy visited Berlin for the first time in June 1963. His declaration of identity with the divided city became one of the most famous German expressions in history.
I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
The Berliners had another reason to celebrate a few months later. By December 1963, the two Germanys had signed an agreement allowing West Berliners to spend Christmas and New Year's with their relatives in the East. American news cameras documented the first visits.
As the midnight deadline approaches, tens of thousands line up to be cleared by communist authorities to return to their homes. Now there is agitation on both sides of the wall to set up a permanent pass agreement that might restore a measure of movement between the communist and free sectors of Berlin.
It was a very small measure of movement. For each year until 1966, there was a separate access pass agreement. But outside the prescribed dates, people could only travel from west to east for family emergencies. Willy Brandt had been mayor of West Berlin when the first pass agreements were signed. In 1970, as West Germany's chancellor, he was pursuing a new policy towards the east. He went to the city of Erfurt for a summit meeting with East German leaders and was overwhelmed by his popularity with East Germans. Economic agreements wove a web of ties between the two Germanys. East Berlin needed hard Western currency, and Bonn let it flow, importing shoes, furniture, and even blood plasma, and buying freedom for political prisoners. Gradually, the division of Germany became part of daily life in both East and West. East German border guards still had shoot-to-kill orders, and even so, the West German government invited the East German head of state to Bonn for an official visit in 1987. Erich Honecker was the first East German leader to come to the West. It seemed as if East Germany's existence was at last secure. In fact, East Germany's existence was anything but secure. The new Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev had been pursuing his policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, economic reform. Moscow was slowly loosening its grip on Eastern Europe. East Germany came under increasing pressure. In 1987, U.S. President Ronald Reagan called for an end to the division of Germany.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
By 1989, East Germany's leadership was in trouble. Hungarian soldiers had begun taking down the barbed wire separating their country from Austria and dismantling the Iron Curtain. For decades, Hungary had been a popular East German tourist destination. Suddenly, it had become more than a vacation getaway. Almost before they knew it, East German refugees were in the West. East Berlin's response was to restrict travel to Hungary. Many East German citizens landed in Prague, the capital of Czechoslovakia. Once there, they sought refuge in the West German embassy and demanded they be allowed to emigrate. Soon, thousands of East Germans were camped out on the West German embassy grounds and trying the patience of the Prague government. West German Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher arranged for all the refugees to be sent on to West Germany.
We have come to you today to inform you that your emigration has been agreed upon.
The floodgates had been thrown open. Choosing to ignore these developments, East German leaders instead celebrated their republic's 40th anniversary. The guest of honor was Mikhail Gorbachev, but the Soviet leader, far from personifying the socialist superpower's might, now stood for glasnost, openness. His appearances led more to a sense of opportunity and freedom than to the fear and obedience of earlier decades. The East German masses found their voice once again, chanting, "We're not leaving," and "No violence." Demonstrators headed for the Palace of the Republic, home of the Volkskammer, the East German parliament. While the crowds gathered outside, deputies celebrated the anniversary as if nothing had changed.
To international solidarity and cooperation, to the peace and happiness of all peoples, to the 40th anniversary of the German Democratic Republic.
The East German leadership continued to ignore developments in their country. Gorbachev tried to warn Honecker that he must take action, or he might be overtaken by history. His words fell on deaf ears. The East German people were taking to the streets to demand reforms. Once started, the push for democracy could not be stopped. In a bid to calm the people, the regime decided on new rules for traveling abroad. It fell to Politburo member Günter Schabowski to tell the media.
And so we have decided on a law that will make it possible for every citizen of the GDR to exit the country at the border crossings of the GDR.
Effective as of when?
As far as I've been informed, this is effective immediately and without delay.
Schabowski had been misinformed. There were no orders to open the border crossings immediately. But thousands of East Germans heard his statement on TV and made their way to the heavily guarded checkpoints. The guards had no instructions for what to do when the masses came to demand they open the gates. The situation could have gone either way. With pressure reaching critical mass, the border guards finally gave in and opened the gates, without official orders. For years, the border guards had been trained to kill anyone attempting to escape to the west. Now, thousands came pouring through unchecked. The people of East Germany had taken their destiny into their own hands. The Berlin Wall fell without a single shot being fired. Old friends and strangers alike fell into each other's arms. In a matter of hours, the symbol of the world's division had been transformed into an image of unity. Thousands claimed the Berlin Wall as their own. They climbed from east to west and from west to east. The most heavily defended border in Europe, where more than 130 people had died, had lost its aura of fear. But it wasn't over, at least not quite yet. The police called the people back from the wall and tried to restore order.
Gehen Sie bitte zurück. Sie werden aufgefordert, zurückzugehen.
One border patrol unit was still on heightened alert. For several hours, the situation remained tense. But the wheels of history could not be turned back. The world order that had existed since the end of World War II was crumbling. For almost half a century, the globe had been divided into two heavily armed blocs, with capitalism in the west and communism in the east. The threat of nuclear war was never more visible than at the Berlin Wall. After 28 years, this wall was torn down, the Iron Curtain consigned to history. Less than a year later, the Cold War was over. Germany was reunified.